Argentinian President Javier Milei warned it would get worse before it gets better. After his first months in office, inflation is finally coming down, but poverty is on the rise. And with another general strike planned for Thursday, will Argentinians be willing to wait for the uncertain outcome of his radical economic reforms? I'm Andrea Sanke, and today's newsmaker is Javier Milei. Argentina, like so many others on the planet, is a country deeply divided over its politics. But after decades of nothing but boom and bust economics, about half the population decided an outsider who has pledged to blow up the system was the only hope they had. Javier Milei has been in office for 5 months now, and so far his administration has witnessed a historic labor strike and an increase in poverty. But it's also overseen some positive indicators, like a budget surplus and slowing inflation. Here's a look now at Javier Milei's first months in office and whether his radical reforms can deliver what's been promised.
November the 19th marked a shocking election day for Argentina. The right-wing libertarian newcomer, Javier Milei, took the presidency in a landslide victory. The result instantly turned Argentina's political landscape on its head.
I want to tell all Argentines today the end of Argentine decadence begins. Today, we turn the page on our history and we return to the path that we should never have lost.
If he's able to follow through, Milei's economic pledges will have a profound impact. He promised to shutter the central bank, dollarize the economy, and sharply cut state spending. He has already achieved some of his promises, but he struggled to implement the most radical parts of his reforms. When Milei assumed office, inflation was hovering at 143%, poverty was at 40%, and the government owed $110 billion to external creditors. So far, his government has ended state subsidies on fuel, devalued the peso by 50%, slashed the number of ministries by half, and cut payments to provinces. And there are early indicators that economists welcome. At the beginning of 2024, Argentina had its first budget surplus in 12 years. Since election, the self-declared anarcho-capitalist has changed his plans to switch to the dollar and get rid of the central bank. But his initial changes have been enough for the International Monetary Fund to unlock a $5.4 billion loan. He's had less luck with the courts, though. They suspended Milei's decree to reduce workers' rights and maternity and severance pay after a union challenged them.
I want the Argentine people to be able to live in peace and to be able to live on their salaries, nothing else. I am retired and I am still working, and I am 69 years old, and I come to fight for the people.
In December, Milei presented his main reform bill to Congress called the Omnibus, which included more spending cuts, the privatization of state-owned companies, and other austerity measures. In response, Argentinian workers, coordinated by the country's biggest union, the General Confederation of Labor, went on a general strike just 45 days after the president took office. It was the fastest strike action of its kind in Argentine history. Congress eventually approved a weaker version of the Omnibus bill in February, and it's now with the Senate for a final vote. And despite Milei's austerity measures, Argentina's yearly inflation rate was 254% in April, and the poverty rate hit 57.4% in January, its highest in 20 years. Rising anger among workers and unions has led to a number of strikes and protests. Still, the question remains, will Milei's economic reforms stabilize Argentina's economy?
So with poverty rates rising while Milei's policies take effect, will patience prevail in Argentina enough to see if his unorthodox approach actually works? And if it doesn't, what will be the consequences? Well, joining me now to debate that and more are from Brussels, Jorge Jraissati, the president of the Organization for Economic Inclusion. From Buenos Aires, Martina Jaureguy is the politics and human rights reporter for the Buenos Aires Herald. And from Ipswich, UK, William Booth is a lecturer in Latin American history at the University College London. Thanks all so much for being with me. Well, I'd like to start with what's happening right now in Argentina and in response to Milei's reforms. We've got another general strike planned for May 9th. Now, he survived the first one already, but Martina, I'll ask you, you are there. Do you think this general strike could really shake up the country?
Well, we've had already another general strike on January 24th. Although it was very big, most unions participated in that strike. It didn't really have the effect the unions wanted. So perhaps it will shake the government a little bit, but I'm not really sure how much that can shake Milei.
Okay, shake exactly, because he seems just incredibly determined to push through everything he can, as extreme as it may sound to those unions in particular.
Yes, we are currently going through a debate on a bill Milei has filed in Congress, which has already been approved in the lower house. Now it's being debated in the Senate. And it basically reforms the entire state structure. It also introduces several reforms like pensions reform, fiscal reform, a labor reform. So it's really a massive changes he wants to make. He has already made several changes with a presidential decree he issued just days after becoming president, overturning and modifying hundreds of laws.
Yeah, Jorge, let me ask you, I mean, those presidential decrees have been pretty powerful for him so far. Do you see him being shaken at all by a second general strike in a matter of months? Or is he really on his way to make the more extreme changes that he wants to make? And do you think those changes are really what Argentina needs?
He's doing exactly what he needs to do to make these changes. Because when you enter in government, you have a period of 6 months in which you can actually try to make as much change as you can. What Milei is doing is reverting decades of bad economic policies, of socialist economic policies, of economic policies that work against entrepreneurs, innovators, young people. So what Milei is doing is what he needs to do. He needs to move forward. He was extremely honest in campaign about the things that he wants to do. So I think that political capital will serve him. And I think the Argentinian people, after so many years of poverty, misery, shortages, inflation, devaluation, they want change. And that's what Milei is bringing. Time will tell, of course, but so far he's doing exactly what he promised.
Okay, let me get William Booth's opinion on that. He may be doing exactly what he promised. Is it going to work for Argentina? Is it the shock therapy that he says Argentina needs and will deliver the change that will ultimately make Argentinians' lives better?
Well, he's not doing what he said he would do. He's had to drop a number of his key campaign promises, dollarization, abolishing the central bank, which turned out to be completely impractical. What he is doing is trying to, with rhetoric of shrinking the state, reducing the ability of government to support people in a period of extreme poverty. Now, poverty may well be reduced in the long term. That may be something to do with Milei or not, but right now it's going up. Inflation is still at around about 11% per month. So I don't really agree with Jorge's assessment that he's doing what he said he'd do. He's putting in place the groundwork for what he wants to do over the next year, and this lower house vote is very important in granting him emergency powers to do that. But the aims that he has for Argentina seem to me to make workers' rights much more precarious, and this is where the general strikes are coming in against those. And I think where I agree with Jorge is that he won't care too much about these strikes. He's got a very negative opinion of trade unions, but that's out of step with Argentine history, where the organized working class is extremely important and proud. And so they could pose quite a serious challenge. The thing that's missing right now is political opposition, and we don't know where the Peronists are going to end up on this.
Interesting. Let me quickly return to Jorge, because on the economic front, I mean, do you feel then that Argentinians should appreciate that Milei has recorded the first budget surplus in over 10 years, and that inflation is finally slowing, even if it's come at the cost of creating poorer people?
I mean, something that we need to clarify is that poor people have been created for years and years and decades in Argentina. This was a previously rich country, prosperous country, that right now is among the poorest in the world, among the less economically free in the world, worst business environments in the world. So inflation is decreasing, as the professor mentioned, 11%, but inflation in December was 25%. So in that case, there is improvement. Obviously, you cannot do everything in a few months. But something that we need to be honest is that he's pushing the agenda that he promised his electorate, which is to reduce the state, which is to liberalize the economy, and everything cannot be done in a few months. But this is a trajectory that he's pushing.
Okay, but Martina, Milei also promised that the political elite would pay, that they would actually feel the most pain for his reforms. Is that what's happening?
Well, he says that 90% of his austerity measures are being paid by what he calls the casta, the elites. But that is not true when you walk out the streets and see how people are struggling to make ends meet. They are not getting pay increases. People are suffering. And I don't really think he's doing what he promised he would do. He cut pensions, he cut provincial funds, he froze public universities' budget. So that's why he isn't spending as much, because he isn't spending as much as he should, because he has responsibilities, like he has to pay for public schools, and education funds in the provinces, for example, were cut by him. So that also caused a lot of tensions with the governors.
Yeah. I mean, William, is he making these broad, sweeping policy decisions without considering their actual effects on individuals? I mean, he said in one interview I saw or read, he said, you can't make a macroeconomic evaluation based on the situation of an individual. That sounds like, wow, then individuals are just kind of being thrown under the bus for these macro decisions. But could it be done another way?
Well, of course, it can be done many other ways. It is literally a politics of sociopathy. In this sense that that's the part of Thatcherism that he really likes, the idea that there's no such thing as society. And he invokes Thatcher a lot as one of his economic heroes, political heroes. If you came to the UK now, where you saw human feces going down the rivers and into the bays, into the swimming areas, that people can no longer swim on the beaches because of the privatization of the water companies, even the Conservative government here has been running parts of the railroads because the private companies can't do it. Thatcher is not a great example for Argentina to take on. He reminds me a lot more, actually, of our very brief and not much lamented Prime Minister last year, Liz Truss, who amusingly he'd never heard of in an interview recently. I think he probably ought to go and read up on her a little bit, because there is no consideration of the real world effects of this. And this is kind of the core of libertarianism, right? It's sink or swim economics. And Argentina, Jorge mentioned that Argentina used to be a wealthy country. Well, in global terms, it was a wealthy country 120 years ago. It's been an upper middle income country for a lot of the rest of that time. And it's still not poor by Latin American standards. But it will be if the economy is massively informalized, if welfare is removed. And we've not talked about this yet, and we might come on to it later, but if the focus of this policy, the investment policy, is to really boost extractivism and make Argentina reliant on global commodity markets again. and that really subjects you to the swings and roundabouts of global economics. So I think it is a very cutthroat way of running an economy, and I'm not sure that Argentines will really appreciate that when they see what that means, and they're seeing what that means now.
Well, they're seeing, I mean, you say they're seeing what it means now, but Jorge, you believe when Milei says it will get worse before it gets better, that it is a matter of time for his policies to work, and then they will deliver something better to the Argentinian people overall. When will that be, and how will it take shape?
To make a transformation and a structural transformation like what Milei is doing, this cannot be done, of course, in a few months. What the professor is doing is that the people could be more impoverished, that Argentina was not a poor country. But let's go to the streets in Argentina. Let's hear what the people are saying, what the young people are saying. They are saying that they are tired about so much economic problems, that they want change. Who are we to judge why these people want change? They want it because they see in their everyday life their incomes going lower, their welfare going lower, and that's why they voted for Milei. So we need to understand this, and we cannot deny this reality. Whether the professor, for instance, agrees or disagrees about the specific policies or the recipe or the velocity in which policies are being done, that's another technical debate. But we can also not completely disregard the reality, which is that the Argentinian people have been suffering for years. In the last decade, GDP per capita has declined by more than 10%. Exports have declined by roughly 30%. Inflation, devaluation, savings of people totally destroyed. What Milei is doing and is applying can indeed backfire. This is something also true. This is something that, for example, in the 1990s in Latin America, we saw how bad structural reforms deliver bad economic outputs. And of course, again, time will tell whether his more aggressive, more shock therapy, as you mentioned, will actually work. Of course, this will also have negative effects in the short run, but it's not that poverty was created in these months. This has been a process of years of poverty.
Sure, but I mean, you know, Martina, yes, it's gotten worse for so many Argentinians over the last decades even, but that worse can go beyond that decline. I mean, it can hit an even deeper rock bottom, even though people don't think it's possible. So if you don't believe his policies can work, what are you expecting to see? I mean, an even more massive divide between rich and poor than what already exists, and that will be even more difficult to reverse in the long term?
Well, of course, we can't deny that we've had high inflation for many, many years. The economic situation is not great. Even before Milei took office. But in the last 4 months, we've seen a downslide, like a dramatic change in people's life quality. And I'm honestly scared of what can happen in the future, because if this is what has happened in just 4 or 5 months, I really don't know what to expect. I'm young, I haven't lived through many governments, but this is the worst I've lived, honestly.
And what about, I mean, speak to us, Martina, daily life there, because we'd heard even before Milei took office how much crime and general criminality had been increasing. Is that expected to get worse as well now? Is that how you're feeling?
Well, I can't say. I'm not a security expert, but we can go back to the worst economic and social crisis we've had, which was in 2001. It was like a social explosion. People, shops were getting robbed all the time because people didn't have anything to eat. I seriously hope that doesn't happen. I hope the government listens to people and what they need and makes a change so something so traumatic and sad doesn't happen again.
Okay. I mean, William, I'm sorry if I sound cynical. I'm just laying out what could be the possible scenarios here. I also want to make it clear that Milei could make this miracle he's talking about, make it work. But if he doesn't, Do you fear that there can be a return to what Martina was describing back in the economic crash of 2001, shops being robbed? There's already a very high level of crime in Argentina that they've seen increase over the years, the most recent years. Would that compound even further?
Well, there's a very clear link in the social science literature between education, welfare, and so on, and the provision of people's life chances. And that's something where Jorge's points really resonate, because that's obviously a perception that our young Argentines wanted to have better life chances. But if you take away funding for education, you take away funding for welfare, crime goes up. It's true all around the world. So that's certainly a possibility. But I think coming back to the broader point that Jorge raises, that people have voted for this, and I don't disagree that people are incredibly frustrated with both Peronist and centre-right governments over the last 20 years. But all of that came out of the original shock treatment of the 80s and 90s, which didn't really work anywhere in Latin America. There was 20 years of economic stagnation or poor performance, and even for a more close to home example, again, to cite Britain, the public finances in the UK were in a mess after the global financial crisis in 2008. The government that came in 2010 chose a period of extreme austerity to deal with that, and it cost us a decade of economic growth. We've got lower real wages now than we had then. So it's not been seen in the real world that this works. And what it does lead to is long-term dependency, even on dwindling welfare, that you will have a lot of people who are permanently excluded from the job market. It's not going to help get young people into the job market, apart from a few entrepreneurs who might have a bit of financial support and might be able to make connections with international markets. But that's not how Argentina has worked in the past. It's had a strong national economy. And that's going to be a very dramatic change, and it could be very politically dislocating. I think looking at how the unions respond to this and how the political opposition respond to this over the next few months is going to be really important in setting the tone for Argentina over the next few years.
So, Jorge, with William saying, the models and examples that are out there already proved that these kinds of policies don't really work. I mean, he's still talking about undoing the central bank and dollarizing, for example, which was an example we saw in Ecuador that also didn't necessarily help, especially the poorest Ecuadorians. So, I mean, what are you looking toward to say that Argentina could essentially be a quite unique example of these these more extreme policies actually working?
Yes, to be precise, there are some economic policies that Milei supports that I disagree with. For example, dollarization is one of them, because it's a suboptimal policy arrangement. It's better just to control things internally and not to depend on foreign currencies. That I agree. Something that I will say is that the same way that, for example, the professor is putting in the mistakes of the 1990s should be put also on the last 10 or 20 years in Latin America, in which you have this socialist wave of expropriation, currency controls, devaluation. And these policies failed. They failed in all countries. They create poverty in all countries. So in this sense, yes, there were mistakes in the 1990s with what is called the Washington Consensus. But equally, or even worse, I would say even way worse, was the mistake of the last 20 years, especially considering all the external favorable conditions that Latin America had. It had the golden opportunity, given the high prices of commodities and good external conditions.
Okay, let me ask one final question from Martina. I mean, how patient can Argentinians effectively be in waiting for these policies to bear fruit? If they start seeing bread lines growing, for example, what will happen?
Well, sadly, we are used to being patient, being resilient. We are used to hearing lots of promises. But, well, it's just a matter of time will tell. I mean, it's been, I am repeating this, it's been just 5 months since Milei became president, and people are already tired because we were already tired from previous years. So, well, I hope things get better, honestly, but from what I'm seeing that Milei is doing, it just doesn't seem like it.
Okay, Martina, that will have to be the final word because very unfortunately we're out of time for this edition of the Newsmakers. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists so much for joining us there. Our viewers, of course, for being with us as well. Remember, you can follow us on X and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sanke. We'll see you next time.